So in this video, we're going to be moving on to the next two main layers of our box model. And in this video, we're going to be talking about margin and padding. So you kind of already have an idea of what these two are. We've talked about them in the first video, we've talked about what they do, but we haven't actually talked about how to manipulate them. So in this video, what I'm going to be doing is going through and working with these two properties to actually manipulate our layout, and that's when the real power of the box model shows. So let's go ahead and get started. The first thing I want to do is go ahead and choose the right thing to manipulate. And in this case, the best thing to work with is an image right here, because it's very easy to see and see the changes when you do these margin and padding changes. And it's also very useful to have a border here, which I added, so you can really see the difference between margin and padding and to see which one is responsible for what. So let's get started. Now, similar to the rest of the properties, the naming is pretty straightforward. In this case, we're going to go ahead and use the shorthand margin property, but I'm also going to be showing you a few other ways, which I didn't show you with the border because these are a little bit easier and they're kind of hard to understand if you just use the shorthand property. So I'm going to be just building it from the ground up. So the first property I'm going to look at is, of course, the shorthand margin property and how to add margin and padding to all sides at the same time. So in case you didn't know, this is called top, this is called bottom, this is left, and this is right. But I'm sure you know that, especially with working with multiple backgrounds, things like that. And pretty much the same throughout all of CSS. So let's get started. So the first thing I'm going to do is go ahead and find my image. And then I'm going to choose which box model layer I want to manipulate. I'm going to go ahead and work with padding first because it's a little bit easier to understand. Then we're going to go and work with margin. So we're just going to type out padding here. And now what we're going to do is go and start adding whatever we want. So remember, if you add just one value, it's going to add the same value to all sides. So I'm going to say, for example, right now 20 pixels. Now if I go ahead and refresh the page, you can see that there is 20 pixels of space between all sides of our image. So you can see 20 pixels on the left, on the right, on the top, and on the bottom. So you can see what's going on here with our padding. If we increase this value, for example, it's going to almost double. Now we have 40 pixels on each side. So that's just a little bit of information about padding. You can see the spacing between the content and the border is getting a lot bigger. Now let's go ahead and change this to margin and see what happens. So I'm actually just going to completely remove this and refresh the page. So now let's go ahead and add our 40 pixel margin. We'll just say for now so you can really see the difference. So now you can see that the content or the space between the content and the border is still the same. There's no spacing at all. But you can see that everything around it has kind of been pushed down. And remember, it's adding margin to all sides. There's 40 pixels between the border and the left side of the page, the border on the top side, the border on the right, and the border and the bottom. So you can see that margin is moving the image itself around the page, whereas the padding is just adding space inside the image. So now let's go ahead and talk about some of the more specific properties in case you wanted to maybe style specific sides. So I'm going to go ahead and change this back to padding, just like this. And now we can go ahead and see our differences a lot more clear. So what you can actually do is add a dash and then the name of the side to it to actually specify which side you want the padding to be added to. So let's just say I wanted to add it to the right side. Now if I refresh the page, you can see that all of this still stays the same, but on the right side there is 40 pixels of padding. You can do this with as many as you want, so you can go padding top, for example, and I want 100 pixels on the top, and let's just say on the bottom. And remember, always with the dash, I just want only 5 pixels. Now if we go ahead and refresh the page, you can see it looks quite unbalanced, but we have 100 pixels on the top, we have 40 pixels on the right, and 5 on the bottom. Now obviously this gets a little bit tedious after a while, after you keep, doing padding right, top, bottom, left, top, right, bottom, left, and it gets quite irritating after a while. So what I'm going to do is show you a really cool shorthand that you can use to style them all at the same time. So we're going to go back to using our shorthand property. And now we're going to go ahead and add 4 values separated by spaces. But it's a little bit confusing at first, okay? So just bear with me. Now what I'm gonna do is for the left, I don't want anything. So, oh, whoops, I need to start from the top. So on the top, I want 100 pixels, like that. On the right, I want 40 pixels. On the left, I don't want anything, so I'm just going to say 0. Now you could say 0 pixels, but in this case, we don't want anything at all, so it doesn't really matter which one you choose. I just prefer to put a 0 there. And then of course on the right, on the bottom, we want 5 pixels. Now let's go ahead and refresh and see what happens. It stays pretty much, oh, whoops, must have confused something over there. So 100 on the top, we have 40 on the right, and on the bottom, there's the problem. On the bottom, we want 5 pixels, and on the left, we want 0. So you can see it gets quite confusing after some time. So you can see that now it's exactly the same. So here's what you have to kind of remember. The first one is the top, the second is the right, then the bottom and left. So an easy way to remember this is by looking at the pieces of the border. If you draw a diagonal line straight in half, you style the top and the right first, and then the bottom and the left. So just keep that in mind and you'll be fine. So if you ever forget, you can always go and check online. There's a lot of references talking about these different values here, and I'm actually just going to go ahead and change it to margin for a second so you can see what's going on. Now you can see if I change the margin, actually it stays in the same position, but instead of adding internal space, it's adding external space. So that's just one thing to keep in mind. But like I said, if you want to go ahead and review this, you can always find some resources online. There's a lot going on there. Now let's talk about shortening this into actually only 2 sections, because let's just say on the top and bottom you want a certain margin, but then on the left and right you want another. This is a pretty common thing that you're going to want to do in CSS. So I'm going to show you how to do that. All you have to do is go ahead and shorten it to 2 values. I'm actually going to go ahead. Yeah, I'll go with margin. The first 2 values are going to be for the top and bottom at the same time. So I'm going to go ahead and add 80 pixels of padding. Oh, whoops. 80 pixels. There we go. And now for our second value, it's going to be our left and right values at the same time. So I'm going to go ahead and add 40 pixels. Doesn't matter the order, because this is always going to be for the top and bottom. This is always going to be for the left and right. So just make sure that they are equal. So let's go ahead and refresh. And now you can see the left and right have kind of stayed a little bit shorter, whereas the top and bottom are the margin is very big. As you can see here, the top and bottom is double the left and right. So that's a nice shorthand that you can use to style two different sides. So for example, now if you can just take this part and this part, style them at the same time, and then you take the left and right and do the same thing with them. So I know that's a lot to take in and it's a lot of different ways, but just remember, if you ever get confused, you can either use the internet or just use margin dash and then the position. But other than that, all you need to know for now is the concept. You just need to know how margin and padding work and how you can actually manipulate them. What they do, I mean, what do you do when you say the margin left is 10 pixels? So just make sure that you know that, when you add a certain space to a position, you're basically changing the spacing between something and another thing based on whichever layer you chose. So for example, if you chose padding, you're going to be changing the spacing between the content and the border. So that's pretty much it for margin and padding. Now we're going to get a lot more experience with this as we go through the course and style more things. But for now, just make sure you know how to use these shorthand properties, you know how to use all those different shortcuts. Now you don't need to memorize them, you just need to know kind of how they work. Obviously memorizing them is good, but if you forget them, don't worry too much about that. Just make sure you know how to use these properly, and that's pretty much it. Let's move on.